Welcome to this Actuarial Research Centre webinar on the use of big health and actuarial data for understanding longevity and morbidity risks. We're delighted that so many of you have joined us today, not just from the UK, but around the world. My name is Andrew Cairns. I'm the director of the Actuarial Research Centre, and I will be acting as today's chairman for today's session. The Actuarial Research Centre, or ARC, is the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries network of actuarial researchers around the world. The ARC aims to be a global network that delivers industry-relevant, cutting-edge research that address some of the significant challenges in actuarial science. And this is through a partnership of the actuarial profession, the academic community, and industry. Research with impact. Our speakers today are Professor Elena Kulinskaya and Nigel Wright. Elena Kulinskaya holds the Aviva Chair in Statistics at the University of East Anglia, where additionally she is Director of the Machine Learning and Statistics Laboratory. Elena is the Principal Investigator on the ARC grant on the use of big health and actuarial data, leading a multidisciplinary research team of both academic staff and staff at Aviva. Nigel is a co-investigator for this ARC research programme. Nigel is an actuary working in the life data science team within Aviva and is an honorary senior lecturer at the University of East Anglia. This webinar will work best if you, the audience, get involved, so we do want to hear from you. There will be 2 question and answer sessions during the webinar, in the middle and at the end. Below the live webinar, you will see a part of the web interface where you can submit questions or comments to the panel. And please don't wait until the Q&A session to do that. You can type in questions at any point during the webinar. But just make sure that you're not watching the webinar in full screen mode. You need to step away from that in order to be able to see the question box and also the live poll down at the bottom of the interface. We will also have some live polls during the presentations, and if you want to see the results of those polls, then you need to vote yourself, and if you want to see the votes accumulating, then you need to vote early. With that, I will now hand over to Elena to get the webinar underway.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, and thanks for coming to hear us. I'm going to tell you today about the progress of our research project on the use of big health and actuarial data for understanding longevity and morbidity risks. As you heard, we have a multidisciplinary team involved. Professor Nick Steele is ex-GP and now population health researcher. Professor Ruth Hancock, also from UA, is a health economist, and we also have statisticians involved, such as myself and actuaries. Nigel is here to vouch for that, and we also have 2 postdocs, Ilyas and Lizanne, on this project, and 3 PhD students. I'm especially grateful to Lizanne Gitzels, who helped with the preparation of this webinar. This is the website of our research project, and we are trying to keep it up to date, so you would be able to download the latest material from this website, and this is open access for all. The main research interest in our project is to quantify longevity and morbidity risks. And the question is how to do that. We all know that medical and social advances are the major drivers of longevity and morbidity changes. And in medicine, they believe that the randomized controlled trials, or RCTs in short, are the gold standard to evaluate various health interventions. You know how RCTs are conducted. Patients are usually recruited to RCT and randomly assigned to either treatment or control group. And there is a belief that randomization will take care of various possible biases, and it will be easy to evaluate an effect of intervention. Of course, RCTs have the limitations. One of those is that the sample of patients is usually rather selective because there are pretty stringent selection criteria to get into the trial. And secondly, they are short-term because the funding usually goes for, say, 3 to 5 years at most, and it's very difficult to evaluate long-term consequences of those health interventions. And then, of course, the interventions which seem to be promising are incorporated into medical practice, and we need a lengthy lead time before we can see effects at the population level. So we are exactly trying to bypass this long lead time with our research. To do that, we are using so-called the Health Improvement Network, or SIN, primary care data, which is the data from the UK general practice to develop statistical and actuarial models of longevity and morbidity. The advantages of using individual level data is that we can simultaneously evaluate both the uptake of various interventions and the effect on longevity and morbidity, and we can also factor in various health factors and socio-demographic factors such as, say, deprivation. And then we usually would feed survival analysis models to individual level data. We mostly use Cox regression, and we would be able then to generalize the conclusions to general population. To tell you more about the SIN data, this is individual patient-level data from primary care. It covers about 6% of the UK population, the data from almost 600 GP practices in the UK. It includes a lot of information such as various consultations, diagnosis, medical tests. It also has 3 variables of socioeconomic status, which is index of multiple deprivation, Townsend score, and mosaic. And it is considered to be representative of the UK population, especially after adjustment for socioeconomic status. Our target, I forgot to mention that our slice of the SIN data consists of 3.5 million patients who were born before 1960 and were followed up to January 2017. And you can see here our target conditions and interventions, of which you will hear much more during this hour. And now we're coming to the first poll.
Okay, thank you, Elena. So I'm sure that you'll have seen that the trend of decades of improving mortality rates in the UK appears to have stalled. This was addressed in the 10th longevity bulletin from the IFOA. So our question to you is, what do you think are the main causes of the apparent slowdown in mortality improvements over the last few years? We've got some choices there. If you can't decide between 2 or more, then I think it's possible to vote for more than one option.
Okay, so just in terms of a bit of housekeeping here. So just as a reminder, if you're currently in full screen mode, you might need to exit that in order to be able to look at the poll. And then if you go down to the bottom of the web interface, that's where you will find the poll and you'll be able to vote. Also, as a reminder, you need to vote in order to be able to see the results. And then secondly, if you, just to encourage you to vote early, if you vote early, then you'll see the votes accumulating and you'll see the bars going up and down as the other people that are watching the webinar also vote. So there's, as you'll see, there's a number of choices here. So we've got diet and lifestyle factors. We've got austerity, extreme weather, antibiotic resistance, flu strains, and previous other drivers of improvements having run their course. And of course, in your own minds, and probably there's no right answer to this, there may be a combination of these things that are really contributing to the slowdown. And that's maybe since 2010 or 2011, whereas before that, the 10 years before that, we saw rather faster improvements in mortality and a slowdown over the last 7 or 8 years. So I can see at the moment that we've got quite a reasonable number of people that have voted. It's quite close. We've got the lifestyle factors are just there in the lead. And then we've got previous drivers having run their course. And indeed, we might hear a little bit more about that in the slides that are still to come. And then austerity. And then there's ones down at the bottom which are very much smaller. So that's so there's definitely some common views coming through here. So I think things have probably stabilized at the moment. So we've really got two winners, if we want to call it that, in terms of the voting. So there's quite a large number of votes which are for the diet and lifestyle factors, and then just a close second is the previous drivers that have run their course. So the medical advances that have gone in the past. And they've really had the or a large part of the benefits of those advances have come through. Okay, so I'll pass back to Elena to continue.
Actually,
oh, sorry.
Pass it to
Right.
Nigel.
Thank you. Thanks. In the project, we've analysed healthcare data to give results on the uptake of interventions, the prevalence of medical conditions, and hazard ratios of death. We've developed methods allowing us to translate these results into changes in individual and population life expectancies. For individuals, the hazard ratio of an intervention is used to convert a chronological age into an effective age. This could help to explain the consequences of conditions and lifestyle choices and can be used to nudge people to pursue a healthier lifestyle, perhaps, along the lines of the heart age calculator that produced recently by Public Health England. So, as an example of this, this slide shows hazard ratios for statin prescription. So it's statin prescription compared with no statin prescription, split by different ages and for different risk of heart disease as measured by the Q-risk2 scores. So for example, this pointer's working on this one, isn't it? Down the bottom here, we've got for age 75 and Q-risk score of above 20%. For statin prescription, the hazard ratio is 0.82. So those with a prescription have lower mortality rates than those without the statin prescription. Then the table on the right here shows the statin prescription for this group decreases the effective age by about 2 years. That's that number there. Whereas at age 65, for the Q-risk score between 10 and 19%, the statin prescription gives no reduction in effective age, and you could track that back over up here where it's showing that the hazard ratio is not significantly different from zero. Then we can use the effects for individuals with different risk profiles together with data about prevalence of these risk profiles within a population to give the period life expectancy as the combination of the life expectancies for the component profiles. And splitting the overall life expectancy into these components allows us to estimate hypothetical changes in population life expectancy for different scenarios. So to illustrate this, we have national life expectancies which are the combination of life expectancies with statin prescription and without statin prescription. So we've got those for males and for females, and then for two different ages we've picked here, age 70 and age 75. So for example, for age 75 women, down the bottom here, the 12.9 life expectancy is a combination of around 13.9 for those being prescribed statins and 12.0 for those not prescribed statins. Following on from this, we can make approximations such as that statin prescriptions have contributed to 72% of the increase in life expectancy at age 70 from 1987 to 2010, and 54% of the increase at age 75. These are the right figures, aren't they? And we can also estimate that the impact of 100% uptake of statins would further increase the life expectancy by, say, 0.7 years for women aged 70, or 1.0 years for women aged 75, or then 0.8 years for men aged 70 and 0.8 for men aged 75. So, questions?
Okay, so well, we now come to the first of the Q&A sessions, and so I very much encourage you to get typing. I think things are looking a little bit quiet at the moment on the questions front, but I have a couple of questions to start off with. So in one of the slides, you mentioned a number of the other risk factors that are part of the analysis. So you have to take account of things such as smoking and other lifestyle factors when you're doing your analysis. So a question perhaps is which of these are very significant in the example that we've just been looking at in terms of smoking versus the actual statins themselves?
Yes, this is a very important question, of course, and I wanted to explain that when we're talking about, say, the effect of statins, we are talking about the effect adjusted for any other possible influences, which means that we're comparing like with like. We are looking, say, at effect of statin, comparing a smoker with statins to smoker without statins, or non-smoker with statins to non-smoker without statins. But of course, we do find that effects of smoking are pretty much significant, as well as effects of various other diseases, which we are also adjusting for.
And for example, for a smoker versus a non-smoker, is the relative risk the same for both groups, or is it perhaps quite different?
Well, for some of the factors, of course, there are interactions. So I don't think smoking interacts with statins. I think that effect is just an additive effect, but there are interactions with other factors.
Okay. So we've got a couple of questions now that have come from the audience. So the first one is, how does a reduction in the effective age, how does that link to an increase in life expectancy?
Well, as we said, we are looking at a reduction in effective age, say, of 2 years, but that is once more reduction in comparison to a person without statins, but with the same risk profile. So you need to factor other morbidities and other lifestyle factors, such as obesity or smoking, to see exactly what life expectancy that person would have.
Mm-hmm. Another one that's to some extent an interesting statistical question. So for the when you're choosing all of the people that go into your study, so you have this very large data set with 3.5 million people, but then you narrow that down. So the question is, how do you select cases and controls in your studies?
Well, this is usually a very complicated question and very study specific. So, for example, we would try to get patients who, well, depending on the design. For example, now we are trying to do another study on statins where we would look at people changing their statins uptake. For example, they can be on statins and off statins and on statins once more. So we're trying kind of to follow this up in real time. So for that study, we would take everyone who is coming to age 60 and is not on statins and then try to see what is happening to them. On the other hand, in that study which we were telling you about previously, we just looked at 4 target ages, 60, 65, 70, and 75, and we tried to see how people who were prescribed statin by that age were different from people who didn't take statins at that age. So it's all pretty study specific.
Okay, thank you. The next question is relates to the poll that we had. So to what extent does the research, does it help to answer the questions in the poll, or some of the options? So we had the austerity measures, which is probably not, you can't answer that, but the other options, if I get that back in front of me, sort of the diet and lifestyle factors, and then the previous drivers of mortality improvements having just run their course. So.
Yes, I think statins is exactly about this, isn't it? We just showed you a slide which said that statins contributed 75%, was it, to the increase in life expectancy at age 70, but now we know that they would add up at most, say, 0.7 to 0.8 of a year, even if 100% of people would take statins, which certainly won't happen. So statins kind of ran their course, and now we are expecting something new.
Another question is exercise a lifestyle factor that you're able to include in your study? And the person that asked the question, e.g. 15 minutes per day brackets, which I do.
Unfortunately, not with this data. The GP data is not very good in recording exercise or diet, I have to say, unfortunately. For that, we would need, say, biobank data.
So maybe just developing that a little bit, are there lifestyle factors which are reasonably well recorded?
Well, we do have BMI, even though there are quite a few missing values. We have alcohol uptake, and we've got smoking once more to some extent, but probably that's about all lifestyle factors we know.
Yeah, okay. Is there an adjustment done by gender and other factors, and how can you decide on this adjustment, and to what extent?
Absolutely. We always adjust for gender, and we adjust for quite a few other medical conditions. For that, we have medical members of the team, and we also look at various systematic reviews and medical literature to come up with a list of morbidities, say, which may affect life expectancy with a condition of interest. We always take this into account.
How are you able to, and how do you allow for comorbidities?
Well, that's exactly what I said. We usually come up with a list of relevant comorbidities for each condition. So, for example, we would add heart disease or diabetes or various other conditions in the list of our possible covariates in the models.
And is that a challenge in terms of really bringing in so many factors that you sort of almost dilute the power of the statistics?
Well, because we have such a large data set, we have hundreds of thousands, say, patients, it is possible to build pretty complicated models.
You mentioned that both medical and social advances have been the major drivers of the risk, I guess that's meaning the all-cause mortality. So in your mind, which of the two, which was the most significant?
It probably depends on what time we are taking in. I'm sure that we are going back to 17th century. Social advances maybe were more important. Yeah. But we certainly take into account social economic status, which is also part of the factors we adjust for in our models, because it's well known that even now, unfortunately, social deprivation may account for 10 years difference in life expectancy.
And I'm not sure, Nigel, if you have a view on that from your life insurance perspective.
Well, so it does depend on how far back you go, of course. And
I guess we're probably talking the last 10, 15 years.
So I think before the last 10 to 15 years, then giving up smoking was a major thing. And my feeling is that giving up smoking is running its course if it hasn't completely run its course, and that the people who are going to have given up smoking have given up. I mean, e-cigarettes still that's got to play out still.
Yes.
But then yes, you've got the kind of the split between prevent blood pressure control, that sort of thing, spotting risk factors early, and addressing them either with diet changes or statin prescriptions or whatever, and then the kind of the treatments that you've got once the problem occurs. I mean, it depends on how you split it, whether it's 50-50 between or more one way or the other.
Yeah. Okay. This is another question for Elaine. It's really about the thin data. So how do you ensure that the thin data is truly anonymized, or is that even possible? And how do you handle that?
Well, to be sincere, it wasn't us who anonymized the thin data. We were given the data which is already anonymized, and we don't have, unfortunately, anything like a postcode, for instance, or even, for instance, I was trying to get some location indicators, and the best we can get is like east of England, but we can't get separation between Norfolk and Suffolk and Cambridgeshire, for instance, and this is exactly for further anonymization of the data.
But you do have some general socio-economic measures for the general practice, the surgery. Is that right? Or?
We usually have socioeconomic status at the patient level, not so. Those measures were linked to the data before anonymization, but we already have the results of that.
And then, additionally, it's all done on a very secure server, I think, is that?
Yes, we keep the data on a very secure server, which is password protected, and we only can log into the server to work with the data. And
for example, we don't. The date of birth, we don't know the date of birth. We've just got a year of birth, and so.
Okay.
I suppose Elena's talking as if it's a problem that we don't know finer detail, but it's a price we have had to pay.
Yes. So maybe just a final question. Let me see if I can find one. So just it goes back to the last point about statins. So this is just somebody trying to make sure they get the right conclusion. So is in the final slides, was it the conclusion that prescription of statins at age 60 increases the effective age rather than decreasing it?
No, I think we had a conclusion that it doesn't change life expectancy. The effect of statins at age 60 was not significant.
Right.
And then at say age 65, as far as I remember, statins would become important for higher Q risk at 20 plus Q risk. And in older ages, once more, statins would become more important even at lower cardiovascular risk. So the advice on statins should be kind of graduated. For more risk and for older people, statins are good.
And the statin study was on people who hadn't already developed heart disease.
Yes, right.
So it's a completely different point of.
Okay. Right. So, well, I think we'll call a close to this first of the Q&A sessions, but please do keep the questions rolling in. And I think some of the questions that haven't been asked quite yet, I mean, they might still be relevant later on. But I'll now pass back to Elena to do the second part of the presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. So we just were talking that statins probably had run their course as far as increasing life expectancy is concerned. So the question is, what will be the next? And as an example of that possible life-expanding intervention, we looked at the intensive systolic blood pressure control. There was a pretty famous clinical trial called SPRINT in the United States, and that trial had two arms. In the first arm, they looked at controlling systolic blood pressure to current guideline, which is 240 millimeters, but in the so-called intensive treatment arm, they were looking to keep systolic blood pressure at under 120 millimeters. And actually, that trial was stopped early because it appeared that intensive blood pressure control provided many benefits as far as heart disease was concerned, but also in respect to longevity. And American Heart Association was so impressed by the results of this trial that they actually published a new guideline in respect to hypertension late last year, where they suggested to diagnose hypertension not from 140 as was previously, but from 130 millimeters of systolic blood pressure. So people in America would have much more interventions than they are currently getting in the UK. So the target of our study was to see how that intensive blood pressure control would translate into current population in the United Kingdom. To do that, we designed our study based on scene as follows. We looked at the patients who had hypertension and had high blood pressure above 140, and then got some new prescription which lowered their blood pressure, and in some patients it lowered the blood pressure to under 120, and that was our intensive treatment arm. And we got about 20,000 patients in that arm. And in other patients, this new prescription would drop their blood pressure just below 140, but above 120. And that was our standard treatment arm. We had 35,000 patients in that second arm. And we tried to see what happened to their morbidity and their longevity. The results were rather unexpected. We know that in SPRINT, the intensive treatment had a hazard ratio of 0.73, which means that intensive blood pressure control was really very important for extended life expectancy. It would translate to a decrease in effective age of about 3.5 years. So would the new American Heart Association guideline provide the boost in the life expectancy in the United States? Our answer is that probably not, because in our study we found that actually intensive group had harmful effects. It increased hazard ratio of death to 1.35, and that actually would translate to an increase in effective age to about 1.7 years. And in both studies, more than 2 blood pressure lowering drugs or higher doses would also be harmful to life expectancy, and they would also much increase the hazard of adverse renal outcomes. So our conclusion was that actually intensive blood pressure control was not good at population level. Actually, I have to say that the Scottish Heart Association agrees with us, and in their new guidelines, they decided not to change a definition of hypertension. And NICE is now looking at their guidelines. And now we're coming to the second poll.
Okay, so for the second poll, we're saying, thinking about the possible stalling of mortality improvements, what would you expect life expectancies to do in the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay, so we have, and it's just a single answer now, not multiple answers, but it's a relatively simple question here. So this is compared to the 2000 to 2010 rate. So is it going to start to decrease? So that's obviously the mortality is increasing, therefore, and life expectancies are going down. Does it remain level, which is perhaps similar to some socioeconomic groups in the last 6 or 7 years? Does it increase around about the same rate as the earlier period, or is it indeed even faster? So we have at the moment, we've got a reasonable number of people who have voted already. We've got a clear front runner, but since we've probably not so many people have voted yet, so I'm not going to see which the front runner is. I need to encourage you to all click on the buttons to get something coming up. Okay, so the front runner is still out there. And it's not being caught up. So the most popular choice is that it's going to increase more slowly than the 2000 to 2010 rate. So that's really similar to the last 6 or 7 or 8 years. A number of people are saying that, and this is the second one, it's saying that it will remain level. So it's really going down or sort of stabilizing even more than it has done in the last few years. Okay, so we'll call a close to the poll there and move on.
Thank you, Andrew. So I was going to tell you about other conditions and interventions we're looking at in this project. And our list of conditions which you have seen before is here on the slide, and on the left is the list of the main killers worldwide. You can see that the first is cardiovascular disease, the second is stroke, and stroke is one of our target conditions, and diabetes is in the 6th place in the list on the left. Diabetes is also one of our conditions. And finally, I'm going to tell you about the hormone replacement therapy. I'll start from the stroke. And this is the topic of our first PhD study, morbidity and longevity after stroke. Stroke is not only one of the main killers, but also there are quite a few people, luckily, who survive stroke and need to live with surviving stroke. So it is important to know how this affects the morbidity and longevity. So we have a study which looks exactly at this. We found actually quite a few cases of stroke, but we decided to restrict the study to so-called ischemic stroke and also to transient ischemic attack, which is called in short TIA. We have study period from 2004 to 2017. We have selected the patients who had either ischemic stroke or TIA for the first time after 2004, and we actually excluded other severe conditions which might affect life expectancy after stroke, such as dementia, cancers, pretty bad chronic kidney disease, that kind of thing. We found almost 84,000 of cases, and we matched them to 236,000 of controls by practice, age, and sex. Our primary outcome is the all-cause mortality, but we also look at various morbidities, in particular other strokes, dementia, heart disease, and so on. Our next PhD project is on diabetes, and on this slide you can see that diabetes, in particular type 2 diabetes, this is kind of a lifestyle diabetes, is expanding all over the world and is projected to increase dramatically by 2035. So in our diabetes study, we found patients who were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes from 2004. We're looking once more at them to 2017. Once more, we excluded patients who had very severe prior morbidity, such as strokes and cancers and dementia. And we found 139 cases and matched them to almost 300,000 controls. Once more, we are usually matching by practice, age, and sex. And our primary outcome, once more, is all-cause mortality, but we also look at various typical complications of diabetes, such as neuropathies, amputations, but also we will look at dementia, cognitive impairment, heart disease, and so on. And finally, we're coming to our third PhD study, which is on hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. HRT is actually a rather controversial health intervention because there is some data that HRT may be beneficial to morbidity and to life expectancy, but there are other data which says that HRT may be bad, say, for cancer. Here you can see exactly the results of one of the systematic reviews on the left, which shows that HRT is good for life expectancy. And in the right part of that slide, you can see that actually the market share of hormone replacement therapy is going up steadily over time. It is above $10 billion so far. In our HRT study, we looked at women who were prescribed HRT from 1984 up to 2017. We looked at women aged 46 years or older. We once more excluded major prior disease such as cancer or dementia and so on. And we found 117 cases. We matched them to 251,000 of controls. We are going to look at the major morbidities and at the longevity. Morbidity we are interested in is osteoporosis, because this is what HRT is supposed to help with. Also dementia and heart disease. Once more, there is data that HRT is good for those conditions. But we certainly also are going to look at cancers and at diabetes, which may be caused by HRT. And this is our third poll.
So as the final poll, we're trying something different from the previous multiple choice questions. So please type in a keyword or expression that represents the most important takeaway from this webinar in your mind.
Okay, so for this particular poll, the poll is going to stay open for most of the remainder of the webinar. So you might not want to just type the first thing that comes into your mind. You might want to just think back while the summary is presented, and then also and we go into the Q&A session. And as the session concludes, you'll be able to see how the word cloud develops. But it will also be useful for the research team in terms of almost an immediate bit of feedback in terms of, well, what does the audience see as some of the important takeaways from this talk, just through these single keywords or expressions. So as I say, that poll will remain open, and then I'll hand over to Nigel to just wrap up the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Okay, in summary, estimating longevity risk and evaluating associated uncertainty is one of the main topics of concern to the actuarial community. Modelling mortality experiences in individual level health data from large health data sets can both establish and quantify the drivers of changes in longevity and help predict how these drivers may change over time. The results can be translated into individual and population level life expectancy changes. Models that allow for differences in prevalence and treatments within the population can be used to transpose results to apply to a subpopulation of insured or pension scheme lives, for instance. Changes in the prevalence of the risk factor of interest are reflected in the life expectancy at the population level, illustrating how much the risk factor of interest has already contributed to changes in past longevity improvements, and how continuing trends of the prevalence of the risk factor of interest can affect future life expectancy. These calculations can be informative for mortality projections of populations of insured and lives and pension schemes. We've presented case studies here on statin prescription and intensive systolic blood pressure control. With the statin prescription, we can quantify the impact of statins on increases in life expectancy for individuals, for the population with current prescription rates, and the potential impact of changes in prescription rates. And then we've challenged whether intensive blood pressure control to lower blood pressure below 120 increases longevity. And then Elena has outlined other target conditions and interventions for the project, which you can look forward to hearing more about in the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Elena and Nigel, for that presentation. So we're now moving into the final Q&A session. I've also seen that you've been busy typing away some keywords, and I should also add that if you want to see the word cloud emerging, then of course what you need to do is to type in your word or expression in order to be able to see what's how that word cloud is developing. But that will remain open, as I say, for a few more minutes. So it's now time for the Q&A, and then we'll, if time permits, we'll maybe have a look again at the word cloud right at the end. So I'll start off actually with a question that I've thought of myself, and it's really to do with the sprint trial and the blood pressure. So obviously you've got quite different results, and so have you been able to pinpoint why it is that there's such a big difference?
Well, one of the main issues may be the differences in how the blood pressure is measured. Basically, in the sprint trial, they were measuring it in a very different way from how it is in the UK clinical practice, where the doctor just measures your blood pressure. They would put a patient in a dark room on their own, and a machine would take their blood pressure. And there is some data which says that maybe their 120 is kind of equivalent to our 140, because the patients were dealt with very differently, and they were not as worried as when the, white gown effect kind of was taken out of the equation.
Okay, if we can have the questions back up now. So again on the sprint and the blood pressure trial, so it looks like sprint had 9,000 participants or thereabouts. Your analysis covers many more people, so shouldn't it therefore get more publicity and coverage by the medical profession?
Well, the answer is that our paper is just accepted in the Journal of Hypertension, and we are preparing press release, so hopefully very soon, maybe next week, all the newspapers will tell you about it. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The next question is about diabetes, and the question is, would you agree that diabetes is more fatal than the data show, and as it is also a contributor to other causes of death? Should more research be done on this?
Absolutely. That's why we're looking at diabetes. It's not only killing people on its own, but it results in more, say, heart disease or even more cancer. And that's why we will look also at morbidity in diabetes, not only at longevity.
Yeah. And do you have a view on where that might go, or in terms of how much, instead of just looking at diabetes as the cause of death, maybe do you have an idea about how much more there is beyond that in terms of the diabetes being a major contributor? Or does that really leave it to the
Yes, we don't yet have results.
Come?
I do hope that maybe next year we'll tell you all about diabetes, but not yet.
Yeah, it's certainly a significant thing.
So the thin data set doesn't record cause of death anyway, so these cause of death figures that we've got aren't from thin. So in thin, what we would see would be a person either with diabetes or without, and then whether they die or when they die, and as well as seeing people without diabetes then being diagnosed with diabetes. And clearly it's not just about how long you live, it's about quality of life as well, so that diabetes also has impact for quality of life.
Yes. And it's a question which I think was there, but it's disappeared off the list, but it's related to the, is there anything within the data that you're looking at that can tell you about the healthy life expectancy as opposed to actual death itself?
Well, this one is difficult. We did think about it and might think some more, but what is lacking in the data is, for instance, so-called activities of daily living. So we don't know whether patients can dress themselves or feed themselves. That kind of data is missing. But of course, we do have diagnosis, so we might try to infer the level of, healthy well-being just from the medical picture, which probably would be a bit biased. We will think about this.
Next question is, drugs have a huge impact on longevity. There's a lot of money going into drug research. To what extent might improvements come from other areas, such as lifestyle, if somebody funded it? That could be a question for either of you, I think.
I mean, I would love to work with actual data on exercise, but as I mentioned, unfortunately, it's not in thin. I do look forward to work, say, with biobank data at some future date, because that does include exercise data.
Okay, yeah. No,
it's strange, isn't it? Because people know that exercise is good, not smoking is good, having a healthy diet is good. So you probably don't need a huge amount of research that's going to tell you that more. Don't need to be told that too many times. It's how you persuade people to give up smoking, eat healthier, take more exercise. But I mean, public health finds that it's far more efficient use of money to spend it on encouraging those things than to
handle the consequences.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, I certainly agree. I think the public health side is probably that's where the money needs to go to some extent. But of course, there may be sort of private agencies that would maybe like to put their own money in, maybe just to try to improve things in other or in more targeted ways. And the next question is, do you think that the research done on thin data might be useful in informing the CMI mortality projection and to, for example, help pension schemes to have better liability cash flow projections? Maybe put that to Nigel.
I think this sort of thing can help you when you're trying to work out how to project mortality improvements. It's not going to give you the answer, but it's going to help you with things like quantifying how big an impact particular medical advances can have. So it can suggest how much more impact, say, statins could have, as we've illustrated. But it could also say that if you want to have, if you're projecting improvements that are going to continue at a particular level, what level of mortality improvements, what sort of medical advances or lifestyle advances are going to have to be there to back that up? So would you need, if you're wanting to continue this, are you going to need something as big as statins every 5 years or every 10 years or whatever? It's all past data. It's not going to tell you what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah. And Elena, did you want to add anything there?
I kind of agree with Nigel. I think that, to my statistical mind, the problem with CMA projection is that they just extend past trends, but they don't really know, as all of us don't know what will happen in the future, and perhaps looking at the medical interventions would exactly inform the assumptions which we could put into those projections.
Okay, well, we'll have one last, I think, a short question, and it's the question is, does the anonymization of data present a significant barrier to more effective research?
No, I wouldn't say significant, even though it does present some problems, but luckily we have data which was already linked with other important variables before anonymization. I think the main driver of further research would be the data linkages. And of course, anonymization may provide some problems with that. So this is my main concern. We want the data, say, from primary care data, linked to secondary care, linked to cancer register, linked to whatnot, and all this should be done before anonymization.
Okay, well, thank you. So I'll just, we'll begin to wrap up now, but we can maybe just talk about the word cloud. So mortality and uncertainty have come out as the most popular keywords from this, but there's other things such as statins, perhaps unsurprisingly, blood pressure and longevity and drivers. But thank you all in the audience for contributing to that. So that really brings us to the end of the webinar. So I would first of all like to thank our two speakers, Elena Kulinskaya and Nigel Wright. And then finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for joining us today.